Hello, thank you for waiting for me. Sorry about that. I will get the names down and see here. So for today, we're covering the second assignment, which is the Spanish. All right, and regarding the term Black Legend, is what happens is in history, very early on, historical accounts were written in Dutch and English, and they vilified the Spaniards. They showed how awful the Spanish were, how to the point that today, Spanish colonization in the early modern era can serve as an anti-model of how not to be today. So, for instance, like with today, if we highly prize egalitarianism just means everyone equal on equal footing. They depict the Spanish as just the opposite, as hierarchical, their society as inequitable. For me, inequitable just means that it's unfair. There are a few people up at the top. There are a few people enjoying the fruits of the availability of resources, and a lot of other people are left out, marginalized, kicked out, and not allowed to share in those the fruits of the economy, etc. So, at any rate, what the Spaniards contended was that was and why something bad has to be black is a whole other can of worms that we'll get into soon. But they will contend that that is a black legend, that is a big dark lie about them. Okay. So what I did is I figured, okay, I'm going to at least do one argumentative section supporting the black legend because it's just so prevalent. It has been running strong as an interpretation that's been adhered to by historians for such a long time. I mean, literally centuries. And so, of course, you have to cover it, right? But at the same time, I wanted to bring in something a little bit fresh, something novel, something different, something new. Okay. And so, as you'll see here pretty soon, when we get into the numbers. And so, but keep that in mind that it is relatively easy by today's standards to adhere to the Black legend if you're writing an historical account about the colonization of the Americas by the Spanish in the 15, 16, 1700s, in the early modern era, because there's just a lot of dirt on them. There's a lot of dirt on what they did in an awful way, etc. All right, so we're going to get into that just as soon as I get all the names. Boy, it takes me a long time. I am very impressed by how many people we have here. All right, so sorry, I'm looking on the previous list, checking off those who were here last class, and then adding new names. All right, so at any rate, look at that. I'm still not finished. That's incredible. So looking at this, what are some things that we could get into as far as the Black legend? Okay. Well, one of the first things you're going to see, okay, is a very ruthless system, that that opened up for Spaniards to take advantage of, and which many of them did. And that system is if you were willing and able to risk your life to come across the Atlantic Ocean to try to take over American pagan lands, if you were willing to do such and risk your own hide, but also risk your own money, right? Unless someone was willing to forward the money for you, you were to be granted a lot of privileges and a lot of, yeah, so let's see here. So you see here on a basic PowerPoint, right, is you have these burgeoning yet insecure monarchs, okay? Ferdinand and Isabella, when you look at their thrones in Aragon and Castile, they were precariously on their thrones. Isabella took the throne from her infant niece, and Ferdinand had more than one half brother who was contending for the throne of Aragon against him. And so their holds over their own burgeoning countries, right, their own regions of Spain were precarious. They were holding on to them, you know, with a lot of insecurity. So it was in their best interest, says the common narrative, to create a rat race across the Atlantic Ocean and to encourage Spaniards to come and tell them, right, with the blessings of the Pope, which we're going to get into soon here. I should have had the Pope on the first one. I'm assuming he's going to be on the second one or sometime soon. But at any rate, what also makes it interesting is the Pope, Alexander VI, was a Spaniard himself, and he issued the Alexandrine Papal Bulls, B-U-L-L-S. And these papal bulls were like edicts issued by the Pope. Okay, and when he speaks ex cathedra officially, that he is to be infallible by this time, right? And so this is like God's representative, the Pope, is speaking. And so at any rate, Alexander VI stated that he encouraged Iberians, Spaniards and Portuguese, to come and conquer the pagan lands of the unknown, of the Americas, okay? In return, they must convert the Native Americans to Christianity and have them baptized into the Catholic Church. But notice the means by which, right? The means by which were not dictated by the Pope. The Pope issued what was known as the Patronato. Okay, let me see if it's on the next one. Yeah, right here. Pope Alexander VI, Papal Bulls at Tordesillas. The Patronato, that granted the latitude to these kings and queens to decide the manner by which the natives were to be converted. All right. And that's big because in some ways, and in some instances, the Spaniards chose very ruthless means by which to convert them. Okay, which we're going to get into soon. So it's kind of a blank check, right? This ruthless, burgeoning capitalist system coming out of Europe that, because remember, they were from the mercantilist economy, whereby the crown dictated what economic opportunities would open to whom. But when they found the markets of the Orient, of the East, of Asia, okay, particularly the Spice Islands, the Moluccas Islands of Indonesia, Japan, India, etc., they began opening that up, these crowns, and allowing these independent merchant classes to develop, okay, who wanted to buy somewhere low and sell it high somewhere else, right? With these commodities that were in such high demand back in Europe. And so with that, they began to kind of cement the modern coinage-based economy with coins and money, etc. And so what would happen is sometimes at these port cities of Europe, is these merchants would open up these long lines with sitting at their benches, and the name for bank comes from the name for bench in Italian. That's not a coincidence. And they would sit at their bench, and they would ask one, mendicant, one beggar at a time, why do I want to lend my money to you? What are you willing to do? All right. And the argument goes on number one of our assignment is Christopher Columbus was shrewd. He realized the best answer to that question was, I'll do whatever you want. Tell me where to go, tell me what commodity to get, etc. So in some cases, like going back to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of Indonesia, they would put together with their money, these rich merchants, private armies to try to literally militarily take over islands and sell a commodity for high profit from doing that. So it's opening up an economic system to people that are outside the nobility, right? To commoners, so to speak. And so it's becoming more capitalistic, whereas private enterprise, each man for himself, etc. Right? When they began discovering these new lands, but it was such a Darwinian, ruthless side of or version of capitalism, because what they were basically being told to do was to conquer, in order to make money of some sort. And the conquering, of course, is going to entail murder, going to entail combat and killing on the battlefield. All right. And so at any rate, they get this this kind of go ahead. And what do you know? A lot of them, right, ended up being second sons of Hidalgos, second, third, and fourth sons, for that matter, of Hidalgos. And that made perfect sense to a lot of historians, because an Hidalgo, right, that was the lowest form of nobility, and it was a form of nobility that was earned by a commoner, most likely, most often, by military success. Okay, so what we're going to get into is Spain uniquely had a fight against the Moors. The North African Moors took over Spain in 711. They very seldom had control of the entire Spanish peninsula, but much of it, very much of it, for sure the majority, for over 700 years. So the fight to reconquer Spain, their own homeland, from the Moors of North Africa, became known as the Reconquest or the Reconquista. Okay, and so their fathers had fought Moors and had been successful and won minor noble status. Okay, and they received some lands. They received entitlement to force those that they had vanquished in battle to work for them on their lands, and other types of privileges and powers that came with Hidalgo status. So the argument is that it's no coincidence that a lot of the self-styled conquerors or conquistadores who came from Spain to the Americas, they had seen their dad do just this, improve his economic and social lot by way of military achievement, receive a higher materialistic standard of living, and they wanted to do the same. And why the younger sons? Because they had something equivalent to primogeniture in England. It was the mayorazgo, and the hijo mayor, the oldest son, received everything of dad's. So the second, third, and fourth sons, you know, they get a taste of a better life. They see their dad do such through military means, and they don't get to any longer reap the benefit of it when the father passes away, but only the eldest son. So they come across the Atlantic to replicate what their fathers had done. So to some people, it's a very kind of predictable pattern that these younger Hidalgo sons answered the call to become conquistadores here in the New World. So at any rate, let's see here. So the monarchs, it was in their best interest to send people over because, of course, they would put it under the flag of Castile. Castile, for reasons we don't have time to get into, was more powerful than Aragon. Isabella was more powerful than Ferdinand. And so it was in his best interest to marry her and unite his kingdoms with her. And they're beginning, it's the beginnings of a modern España, modern Spain. And so, because there were at least, 5 provinces of Spain throughout the Middle Ages and so forth, Navarre, Leon, Castile, Aragon, at any rate. So they're trying to unite Spain together, and she's trying to become the most powerful leader of Spain. And so she's telling Spaniards, please, by all means, go conquer, and I will grant you Hidalgo status and lands and entitlement to the labor of those beneath that you defeat. And that was called the encomienda system. And so it was a win-win for her because she wasn't risking her neck coming across here. All right. And so at any rate, Christopher Columbus lands in the Caribbean. He lands on an island that they're not even positively certain about which one it is today. and he names it San Salvador, Holy Savior. And it's very interesting because he's a paradox in that he clearly shows motives of power and material enrichment, but he also at many times sounded very, very religious. Okay. And so God and gold, right? And glory were the three G's. So as he was coming across here, he makes a deal with the Arawak, Arawak. And when he meets the Arawak, he's very condescending about them, the first native group he meets, in his journal, and so is his son. And in it, right, they depict them as childlike. They say that they walk about virtually naked, and to them that was symbolic of them being like a child who knows no different, walking around naked. It feels no shame because the child is innocent. He said they cut their hands, grasping the Spaniards' swords out of ignorance of metallurgy. And when his men traded the natives, even despite the linguistic barrier, that the Spaniards very quickly grew arrogant in their ability to con the Native Americans and get them much better into the deal, and trading them just trifles, as it translates to English, in return for much finer things. And so to the point that he even has to give an order to his men to stop taking advantage of the Native Americans in trade, etc. But a couple things happen. Is one, his men began to supposedly sexually harass and attack some of the Arawak women at a fort known as Fort Navidad, Fort Christmas, when he left them to come back with more supplies. So he comes back, and his 50-man garrison of Fort Navidad has been wiped out, and the men have been massacred. And he was furious, wanting to know what happened. Well, the cacique, as he was called, the local chief, feigns ignorance, says that it was likely one of the hated Carib tribe that the Caribbean's named after, because the Caribs, they quickly became demonized by all other parties. They supposedly were cannibalistic. They would ritualistically eat their prisoners of war to imbibe their strengths and their good qualities and fighting qualities, etc. So they tried to blame it on the Caribs, but what he finds is a gun wound through the thigh of that cacique. And so now he knows that one of his own men had shot at this cacique, who was supposed to be his military ally against the Caribs, which he had established right away a military alliance with the Arawak. And so it doesn't take long before they arrest the cacique, and from there it devolves into a war with the Arawak. So now they're at war with two of the three tribes of the Caribbean, the Caribs by virtue of a military contract right away, and now the Arawak in virtue of the Fort Navidad massacre. And then some of his men take off in some of his ships without his permission, looking for gold. And one of the islands where they were supposedly finding it and looking for it was modern day Puerto Rico, Boricuan. And so he tries to get his men from Boricuan. He has some of them executed in front of his own men to make a statement that they cannot engage in any kind of mutinous acts while they're here in the New World. But it still doesn't save a war with the tribe of Puerto Rico as well for getting involved in their gold mines. And they were known as the Taino, Taino, which in their language meant the nobles. And so before you know it, it didn't take long at all. By the middle of their second of 4 trips, Columbus's trips into the Caribbean, he's at war with all 3 tribes, major tribes of the Caribbean. All right. So at any rate, from there, you have a guy who comes at the end of the 4th trip. His father had been an eyewitness to this stuff as a scribe, and his name was Bartolome de las Casas. And so he writes a depiction of what happened in the Caribbean, and it's known as you see there in Spanish, a brief relation of the destruction of the Indies. So today, oftentimes, if you want to find it, it's known as a classic. It's usually truncated to Destruction of the Indies by Las Casas. And in it, right, he makes absolute villains of the Spaniards. I was fortunate enough to be a double major with Spanish and having a Spanish literature book that has direct quotes from this book in the Spanish language. And he says it in there. He says and I'm translating to English, but he says that the Spaniards came as tigers and wolves, seeking whom they could devour. And he says the Native Americans were mere meek sheep, ovejas mansas. And so he clearly, this is, as I said in the first class lecture, this is conflict history, right? Where you depict how things go down as a matter of power relations, of fighting for power politically, economically, and socially. And you make villains out of those who won. And you try to engender within your readers a sense of empathy and sympathy for those who lost. So this clearly is conflict history written by Las Casas. He had multiple death threats by Spaniards back at home, calling him a traitor to his own people, etc., taking the obvious side of the Native Americans. And we do know that from measles and smallpox and other epidemics that were supposedly inadvertently spread by the Spaniards, that there was a, quote, a demographic catastrophe, as they call it. Millions of Native Americans died of disease and just wiped out entire tribes throughout the Caribbean, especially. And so you have that, okay? And then by 1502, the Spanish established their hierarchical system. And I'm going to wait to get onto that, okay? But that's where, so that's just 10 years after Columbus's first trip. They began establishing a Spanish hierarchy over the Caribbean. Then from 1519 to 1521, Spanish conquistadores under Hernan or Hernando Cortez, they came in and almost miraculously, as far as their small numbers, captured the Aztec Empire. And so Tenochtitlan, or modern day Mexico City, and the capital of the Aztec Empire of Mexico, fell in the summer of 1521. And very, very interesting accounts of it you could find in Sahagún's book called Broken Spears. I think that it was a translation from the Nahua, the Aztec language. They called it the day their spears were broken, when they lost. And then Castillo, very interestingly, was a conquistador. So you could imagine, you could easily guess the kind of tenor or tone of his book is he's going to try to justify what the Spaniards did from the perspective of the conquerors themselves. And so what he writes is he contends that Sahagún's book, Las Casas's writings were propaganda, were deliberately exaggerated, taken out of context, etc. So he says, I'm going to write La Historia Verdadera. I'm going to write the true history of what really happened. And of course, it's from a Spanish perspective. All right. Then 1535, Jacques Cartier claims the Mississippi River Valley, all up and down the Mississippi for France. And at that same year, the Spanish found Baja California, thinking that it was an island at that time. So they named it California after Las Sergas de Esplandian, a novel at that time that wrote about an Amazonian queen and her tribe of women warriors who lived on an island of California. And so, yeah, they found it at that same time, and they discovered, quote, the Pacific Ocean. But they are not going to sit back and refuse to contest the Mississippi Valley from France. But they have a rival. So notice the English aren't in the game yet. Then in 1540, the Spanish claimed the Southwest through Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. He came up and he was, yes, looking supposedly for the 7 cities of Cibola, which were 7 cities of gold. And of course, they did not exist. and he was disgusted. He claimed that the lands that he went through the modern day Grand Canyon, all the way up into modern day Kansas through the Southwest. He contended that the land was barren and didn't yield much promise. And that had consequences for the Spanish. They didn't make the Southwest, a present day US, a high priority based upon Coronado's account. And then Upper California, as opposed to Baja, was claimed by Cabrillo. Cabrillo may have been Portuguese, hired by the Spanish. And he went up to the top, pretty much the modern day border of California, right up about Oregon, and came back down. He didn't survive the trip, but his men claimed it from his trip, Alta or Upper California for Spain. And they'll hold on to that for quite some time, until the 1820s. Then the Spanish claimed the Southeast and the South, much of like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, all the way up into Tennessee, under a guy named Hernando de Soto. He is, the depictions of him come from the survivors of his expedition, and the survivors literally engaged in mutiny against him. So the poor guy didn't live to be able to defend his own name. He's given a bad name in the history sources by his own men, that he was ruthless, unnecessarily violent. At times, right, when they were desperate for food, they would engage in extortion. His men said he would order them to threaten to kill Native Americans if they didn't get the food that they needed. That's just one example of a negative depiction of De Soto, claiming up that land. And then Cabeza de Vaca, right? He was actually 1528, but his book was in the 1540s. He was a part of the Narvaez expedition to claim Florida, and the Appalachee, the Tallahassee, and these other tribes were very powerful in Florida, of Native American chiefdoms and with the number of warriors, etc. And they were like Ponce de Leon before them in 1511. They were attacked and soundly defeated. Narvaez himself, I believe, would be killed. And Cabeza de Vaca and a black man named Esteban or Stephen would get onto a small boat and drift into the Gulf of Mexico and be captured by one Native American tribe and sold to another. And they were enslaved by them until, according to his story, he was able to show that he had power as a healer and as a medic. And then they gave him his freedom. He came back down to Mexico, told his story, and he became a bestseller back in Europe. And it was called Naufragio. Naufragio means shipwrecked in Spanish. And so at any rate, based upon his claims of where he was going through Texas and all that through the South, the Spaniards claimed that land, said, we got a claim on it. And it's interesting, right? Their claims, because even the Protestant countries that didn't acknowledge the Pope were operating from the same premise that if they are pagan lands, if they are non-Christian, you have a right to take them. Just as simple as that, a very simple religious justification. And then they also had some more justifications we're going to get into today, a couple others. But at any rate, 1565, St. Augustine, Florida, was established by Pedro Menendez de Aviles. He was a bit ruthless. There was a French Huguenot or French Protestant, Fort Caroline there in Florida. He had them massacred. He was willing to shed blood, that's for sure. And he established the oldest remaining Euro-American city to this day, which is St. Augustine, Florida, from 1565. Then in 1599, Don Juan de Oñate came in to claim New Mexico. And boy, if you're interested, there's a book called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away by a guy named Ramirez. And it is a very, very fascinating book. It's conflict history. The Spaniards are pretty awful in the book. It's all about power. The Navajo and other natives of New Mexico heroically rise up on occasion and have some success in their rebellions and so forth. As a matter of fact, if I were to be given the obligation by a professor to adhere to the Black legend and do a good conflict history of villainous Spaniards, always out for power, always out for exploitation of Native Americans, trying to get you to elicit your sympathy for the Native Americans. And I had to do it within U.S. territory. I subjectively would choose New Mexico. There's just a lot of conflict, a lot of power plays, a lot of rebellions, etc. Not to mention the Franciscan missionaries who were sent in there. They had a much worse reputation than they will have in California and in other areas, other colonies, for exploiting and being ruthless with the Native Americans, etc. And then coming from a 1767 edict of the Bourbon reforms back in Spain, they will establish the famous Sacred Expedition up into Upper California and establish the famous 21 missions up the coast of California. And we'll get into some of that today as well. All right. So at any rate, before I get into those things, let's see here. We'll notice another thing here is paternalism and Spanish contributions. Okay, this will be on the test, so I feel like I should mention this, is Roman and Germanic law. When you look at functionalist history, instead of looking at, good guys and villains and power plays, etc., and you just look to how we got to where we are today and who contributed what, that's called functional history. The Spaniards brought Roman and Germanic law. They brought the formation of the modern pueblo or city. So down to the grid system of streets, city council with a mayor, so law, transportation, a lot of the basics of the format of urban organization to this day, the Spaniards brought. Arts and sciences. It didn't take long for artistic and poetry and other movements back in Spain to make their way here into Mexico and up into the frontier, as it was called, up here into California from Mexico. Because as you may know, the Spanish put things into about 4 viceroyalties, and the viceroyalty of New Spain or Mexico was established all the way down at Mexico City, and they were in charge of everything up here, which they called the frontier. Arizona, New Mexico. They called Arizona Pimeria Alta because the Pima were the native tribe. It was mainly through Jesuit priests that they sent up there. And New Mexico, they sent the Franciscans, and they sent Jesuits also into Florida, and they sent the Franciscans up here into California. And then also Hispanic culture. Much to this day of Hispanic culture came from Spain, an amalgamation, right, with Native American customs and beliefs. So the Day of the Dead and those types of things, right, are perfect examples of synthesis between Spanish and Native American culture. All right, so let's see here. I want to get to that when we do that. So, yeah. So now, if you don't mind, I'm going to move to the assignment. All right. Let me move this up if I can. So number one, you guys, please, this is a perfect example of this is not my thesis, okay? I read this under a book. I thought it was thought-provoking. That's it. That simply was thought-provoking, all right? So this is not of my personal subjective take. But Columbus's world, right? And this comes from David Boyle's book, Toward the Setting Sun. What you'll find on number one, okay, is he suggests, and I'm just summarizing his work, that Columbus was put into a corner, that his back was against the wall, that he was mired in poverty, that his poor father worked so hard and could not extricate himself and his family out of poverty. So Columbus saw the window of opportunity and he had to take it. And of course, what did that entail? That entailed playing the game. That entailed telling the merchants, I will do your dirty work. Tell me what to conquer, tell me where to go, tell me what resources to bring back, and I'll do it. So hence, right, he went to the Ivory Coast, Columbus, and bought slaves with his merchant benefactor's money. Bought slaves and brought them to where they were supposed to go. He went and fought for a spice island and engaged in military fighting. All right. When he was writing a letter to Ferdinand, whom he owed money to, okay, he writes at the Arawak that they are most wondrously timid. He writes it at least 5 times in that letter. And he says, just tell me, do you want slaves? We could easily capture as many as you like. You want 50, you want 100, you want more. It sounds so callous when you read his letter. But again, right, he feels beholden to pay back his benefactor. His benefactor is the one who gave him this job, who gave him this opportunity. He has to make profit for his benefactor. He's just doing the necessary dirty work that his boss is sending him to do. And he had to do it to get him and himself out of poverty. All right, and you can find further details in number 1 to look into. But please remember, okay, no matter which one you choose, please read all of them, because something pertinent to test 1 is found in every number. So again, that is not what I personally think, but I thought it was thought-provoking. So by all means, tear into it. Number 2, Spain enslaved by the prejudices of her time. All right, we've had the Enlightenment, right? That states, the social contract, natural rights of all human beings. Government is our servant, not our master. We've had the scientific revolution. We've had classical liberalism in the 1800s. Classical liberalism, I think of like John Stuart Mill, says basically, you do your thing, I do mine, and wherever you swing your fist ends where my nose begins. You do whatever you want, freedom-wise, be autonomous, be the arbiter, the decider of your own destiny as an individual, until it infringes upon someone else's rights. That's the only limitation to your freedom. That's classical liberalism. It was huge. Even if you're not familiar with it yet, our world has been profoundly influenced by that. To each his own. The Spaniards are fighting and living in the 1500s, the 14, 15, 1600s, okay? They were in the midst of the Reconquista. So that's all they knew back in Spain, was fighting a holy war against the Muslim Moors of North Africa and kicking them out of Spain. All right. They had a pilgrimage site in Santiago de Compostela. And they believe St. James was there, was buried there. And so St. James, Santiago, became their patron saint of holy war. So they would say, Santiago con nosotros, St. James with us, fight with us, when they would fight against the Moors back in Spain. And guess what? When they fought the Aztec, when they fought the other tribes here in the Americas, they said the same thing. They brought that world, that mindset, that worldview with them, that ethos. Okay? They had a pope telling them, you must go and save the savages of North and South America and the Caribbean. It's your Christian duty to make sure that they're converted. Because, of course, as you know, with a Christian worldview, if you die without Christ, you go to hell. And so there's that great incumbent, fear of damnation for those who die without being Christians, without having Christ. You also had it taught in the 1500s from a few verses in the Bible that you see right here. Deuteronomy chapter 32. I know there's a lot of religion on this one. The 106th Psalm, book of 1 Corinthians, it states that pagan gods were not simply mythical and made up gods, but actual demons disguised as gods. So you see here, Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo. Where is it here? Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, while admitting to Cortez's propensity for ruthlessness and treachery, attests to the sincerity of Cortez's seemingly well-intended suggestion to Moctezuma II of the Aztec that he stop worshiping evil demons and replace Huitzilopochtli's serpent-laden altar with a cross and a portrait of the Virgin Mary. Likewise, historian David J. Weber contends that it was not an anomalous occurrence when Spaniards hosted by California Native Americans shot a loud crow that the natives depended upon ritualistically for divine guidance, and the Spaniard who shot the crow said, "Eso fue el diablo." That was the devil, the soldier contended, using the term savages to label Native Americans. And so when you read Castillo's account, his true history, and of course, right, it's very biased toward the Spaniards. That's easy to predict as far as who wrote it. But in it, right, he contends time and time again that there were religious and cultural differences between the leader of the Aztec, Moctezuma II, and Hernando Cortez of the Spaniards, and how they had a fallout, as you see in the Temple of Huitzilopochtli, arguing over their gods, and how that began the beginning of their drama of fighting each other. And so at any rate, right, I'm trying to contend on number 2 that the Spaniards didn't know any better. That yes, of course, by today's standards, the Spaniards were ethnocentric, right, putting their culture, their worldview as the center of the universe, and judging everyone's, behavior and beliefs based upon their own vantage point. But that's all they knew. That, of course, today we know not to do this, but how could they have known back then? That's all they knew. That's the world they lived in. And that we likely, very often, are mere products of our environment and of our times. And that's called historicism, the fancy word for that. That you can't judge people from a different time period, that people are products of their historical circumstances. So you see the last sentence. Sociology informs us that people are heavily influenced by their environment and socialization. So wouldn't judging early modern era Spaniards by today's standards seem unrealistic and unfair? Again, I thought this was fun to write. I like to think that you're going to get a lot of information about the religiously ethnocentric and even religiously violent things that the Spaniards did. But by all means, feel free to disagree with number 2. Because one instance of rather ruthlessness by the Spaniards could be found in the requerimiento, the requirement, the requerimiento, the the Spaniards would read the Nicene Creed of the Catholic Church. And at Nicaea, that goes back to the 300s when they decided which books would be put into the Bible. Okay, it was a huge synod, as they were called, religious gathering to make major decisions on belief and practice of the church. But at Nicaea, they made a creed, right, about the major fundamental beliefs of Christianity. Well, they would read the Nicene Creed, and they would tell the Native Americans they have 24 hours to accept the Catholic Church and the Christian faith, or they would declare holy war against them. At one place called Acoma in Arizona, they'd had the governor's brother murdered in an altercation when they were trying to trade with each other. So they came back in a punitive raid to punish, right, the people of Acoma. But the priest mandated to them that you are to mortally wound them, but don't immediately kill them. Give us time to give them to say last rites over them before they die. All right. And then another thing that I think is of importance is going back to Sahagún. Remember, he wrote the Broken Spears account of the fall of the Aztec, and he clearly wanted his readers to feel sorry for the Aztec. He also brought about the translation of the codices. The codices, right, are singulars, codex. They were literally written books by the Aztec. The Maya had them too. And they would have pictographic writings, right, hieroglyphic writings of pictures that meant something about their culture, their practices, and their history. Just fascinating. To this day, you could read the codices in most libraries, major libraries. But at any rate, he got the young Aztec kids who were noblemen and trained in the hieroglyphics and what they stood for. And he had them learn the Castilian Spanish language and write out what each picture meant. And that's how we have a lot of the information we have about the Aztec, their culture, their history, etc., from the translation of these codices. And there are some people who wanted them burnt. Some of the clergymen said that they were of the devil and they need to be burnt, etc. But of course, not Sahagún. So Sahagún, in many ways, was a champion for the rights and the historical legacy of the Aztec. But even he, right, as you see here, it says, in the writing of the natives sacrificing children, ripping out the heart from the chest to a rain god, could not abide the continuation of such a practice. He imputed blame for such a deed, not on the Aztec, but on Satan, our ancient enemy, who has blinded them into committing such an infernal deed. So needless to say, this champion of Native American rights agreed with his less tolerant Spanish contemporaries that Mexico's Native Americans needed to convert to Catholic Christianity. So even some of their best champions and defenders in the form of Spaniards and Spanish leaders, even they agreed in the time period they were living that they needed to convert, that their souls needed to be saved. All right. And we're going to get to the missions soon. So then number 3 is just an account to give you one facet of the Black legend and supporting it. Okay. Like I said, I didn't do a whole lot in support of the Black legend because it's just so old. It's literally centuries old. It's like a broken record. Yes, the Spanish could be awful, etc. So instead of showing, because I feel like I have some data on the first two, on their ruthlessness as far as violence and some killing, which obviously is awful. I feel like I've incorporated some of that on the first 2 numbers. Okay, even if I'm, however you think, trying to justify it or contend that we don't have a right to blame them for that, which by all means tear into that if you like. But with number 3, I focused on the inequitable part. not the ruthless, not the ethnocentric, okay, not the greedy for gold, but the part of the Black legend that states that they established an inequitable society, an unfair society, where a few people derived the majority of power, derived the benefits of economic resources, social prestige, etc. And as you see here, right, I start off with economics. So the consulado was decided on monopolies. They would decide what the biggest money makers were anywhere in the world, right, connected to the Spanish economy. And they would decide to whom they would appoint the privilege and the opportunity to trade in those lucrative fields. So you had gold, obviously, those who had the right to form gold mines, etc. You had, sorry about that, I didn't turn my phone off. You also had cocoa, right? Like chocolate. I kid you not. Chocolate was a huge moneymaker. Sugar was a huge moneymaker. Molasses and whiskey were huge moneymakers. Sadly, African slaves were a huge moneymaker. You had to have the right connections with the consulado to be able to trade in those commodities. I hate to call a slave a commodity, but you know what I mean. Okay. So the consulados were connected to monopolistic opportunities that only the well-born were entitled to, the well-connected, because they had different levels of nobility back in Spain, right? Remember, aristoi means the best in Greek. So the aristocracy are claiming that they come from better blood, derived from all the way at least as early back as the Roman conquest in 250 BC of España, of Spain. And having like Roman and Iberian was the native Spaniards, blood of leaders all the way back then. All right, and so you had that, okay. Then you also had the fact that corregidores, like the verb corregir in Spanish means to correct, right? The corregidores, they would come in to the city councils and the mayors at the local levels, and they would make demands from the Spanish crown. They wanted so much in taxes. They wanted so much in tribute. And remember, in tribute usually was either in the form of public works, to build a church, to build a bridge, to build a road, etc., or in the form of military service, to be enlisted as soldiers to fight for the Spanish army. Okay. So the corregidores, they could come at will and make high demands on the people there. Now, going back to the hierarchy itself politically, all right, let's go back to this, if you don't mind. All right. So firstly, you had the king and queen. They handpicked the Council of the Indies. These were handpicked men who were the most powerful men in Spain. Okay, like you have the Archbishop of Toledo, where they get the term like Holy Toledo, right, of Spain. You had the highest ranking caballeros, the high ranking high noblemen, a handpicked few of them that were in this group. Relatives to the king and queen, etc. The Council of Indies would get together and write the laws in the Americas. Now, they started off on the foundation of the laws of Castile, okay? And by the way, according to the Black legend, that already was not good, because Aragon, for instance, right? With Aragon, you had traditions that didn't hardly exist in Castile. So, for instance, if Ferdinand had been more powerful than Isabella, if it had been the opposite, and his Aragon would have prevailed, and the Aragonese constitution prevailed. In Aragon, cities had things called fueros, right? Like fuera de algo, like outside of something. Fuero, a fuero, right? Like outside of the legal terms. It is that you as a city are not bound by all of the crown's decrees. You have certain rights that even the crown cannot infringe upon. Because sometimes it was only high-ranking clergymen and a very few number of aristocrats who had fueros, right? But towns, actual pueblos in Aragon had those. And that wasn't brought over to the New World because they carried Castile's, Isabella's region's constitution instead of Ferdinand's. You also had something called obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey, but I don't carry forth, or I don't comply. And it's a form of like nonviolent civil disobedience. Is if something goes against your religion and your personal beliefs, and you have been ordered from above to do it, it's your polite way of saying, no, thank you. I will not carry that out. That was a known political tradition in Aragon, but not in Castile. So that's another missed opportunity politically for those in the Americas, because they got Castile's constitution and not Aragon's. Okay. And in fact, in Castile, you had had more than one crown, one king or queen, contend that he or she had poder real absoluto, absolute royal power. Okay. So it was not as democratic being under Castile. But then they changed things, right? And saying that, well, we can't just make a copy of the Castilian Constitution and send it 3,000 miles across the Atlantic and have it work perfectly. There clearly are certain conditions that are unique to Americas that need to be considered in a flexible fashion. So that's what the Council of Indies did, is they tried to form as much of the Constitution of Castile as possible, but make it a little bit more flexible for conditions of the Americas. But again, these are handpicked, like 5 to 12 men. Okay. Then they send over a virrey, a vice king or viceroy. That viceroy is to carry out all the laws and into their execution. So literally, he or she has pardoning abilities to literally pardon someone who's going to be sent to death, or the power to have people executed once they've been convicted. The viceroy was carried on a litter and was supposed to reflect the royal majesty of the crown back in Spain, as a reminder for people 3,000 miles across the ocean to remember that they had a king across the ocean. So the viceroy was all powerful, handpicked, high-ranking Spaniard, needless to say, etc. The audiencia was the court system, right? The oidores, like oír, to hear, listen, right? So the listeners, literally, of the audiencia. They were to do what judges do, adjudicate disputes, like serve as a referee with disputes and resolve issues, and decide upon guilt and innocence in criminal law, etc. These were well-respected, well-educated Spaniards from the Iberian Peninsula. So they were called Iberians, right? Or peninsulares, from the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, to be trusted. Then you had handpicked, not elected, governors, gobernadores. And so again, notice this is not democratic at all. This is very hierarchical. Okay. And again, the governors oftentimes were Spaniards. Then you had the corregidores, like I said, who could veto local decisions made by the city councils, the cabildos, who made demands as far as tribute and taxes. And then you had the city councils of cabildos, and only then at the local level could you get people of mixed blood. Because remember, in a lot of these countries, the majority of people were mestizo. They were of Native American and Spanish blood, because so many of the conquistadors came as single men, and they ended up having children with Native American women. So some might able to be regidores in the city councils, or an alcalde mayor, which we get the term mayor from. Okay. So this was briefly interrupted by the conquistadores, who came as conquerors, received a lot of land, received the encomienda of forced laborers underneath them, had like governor-like powers. But what the argument is that there were two conquests of Spanish America. First, the conquistadores conquered the Native Americans. And then secondly, the royal crown conquered the conquistadores. And a perfect example of that is Hernan Cortez. He ended up having a lot of the lands and titles that were once given him initially stripped from him, and he was forced to be under house arrest back in Spain because they didn't trust him with this newfound power. All right. And so in addition to that, informally, well, somewhat informally, is they developed a pigmentocracy. This was named in the 1970s, and the name is stuck by an historian or an anthropologist. Is they literally had, in some of these cases, you guys, writings from Spain saying they wanted for men in certain key positions, cleanness of blood, limpieza de sangre, right? What do they mean by cleanness of blood? Okay, they want people who were pure Spanish, which I think is a crock when you look at Spanish history and how pluralistic it is, how diverse it is. But at any rate, supposedly pure Spaniards from the peninsula. They wanted them to be the governors, the oidores of the judges, the all these other positions, the viceroys, etc. Then beneath them, you had the criollos, the creoles. They had two Spanish parents, so claimed that they had pure Spanish blood, but they were born here in the Americas. And they really were kind of relegated to second-class status. And it probably won't surprise you to know that a lot of the leaders of the wars for independence in Latin America to break free from Spain and form an independent Chile, Argentina, Mexico, etc., were criollos, men who felt like they were entitled to lead just as much as the peninsulares were. They certainly didn't feel inferior just because they were born and raised in the Americas, and they were proud of their Spanish blood. But the majority of people were mestizos and castas, were mixed blood, were both Native American and Spanish. And it's just a fact that very few of them reached any type of high political position. Very few, if any of them, ever received a monopoly from the consulado to engage in one of the real lucrative trades. They just were kind of marginalized. And then at the bottom, you had the natives and the slaves, indios and esclavos. Right, so going back to the assignment. Number 3 just supports the Black legend, focusing on the inequitable part of the criticism of the Spanish. That it was a very inequitable, unfairly, undemocratic, aristocratic, oligarchic society. Then number 4, the title says it all, you guys. Spanish missions were a proverbial mixed bag. Okay, the very first accounts of the missions were written by missionaries. So you could take an easy guess as to the tone of those books. They were called hagiographies. And a hagiography literally was a biography written by someone who was trying to promote the person that he was writing about to become canonized as a saint. Okay? So you had a guy named Francisco Palau. And he wanted to make a saint of Junipero Serra coming into California. So what do you get in that book? You get an absolutely self-sacrificing, selfless, benevolent, paternalistic Junipero Serra. He didn't care if he was to be martyred in California. He deprived himself of a lot of daily physical comforts. He was constantly concerned about the well-being of his neophytes. The neophytes were the Native American converts that had joined the missions. He fought against, in particular, two successive Spanish governors over California who were in charge of the armies. Because remember, they would put up a mission, then a pueblo, a city, then surrounding plantations or haciendas, right? And then a presidio, a fort, a military fort. And so these people at the presidios developed a reputation for raping the Native American women on the missions and in the pueblos. And Junipero Serra, according to Francisco Palau's accounts, just went to war with his own fellow Spaniard governors and soldiers, to the point of that where they would threaten and say, "Fine, we're gonna take away the presidio, and let the Native Americans just let you be at the mercy of the Native Americans and let them kill you. And how would you like, us revoking our protection?" And Junipero Serra did not take their bait. He said, I would love that. I'll be at God's mercy. Just get out of here. You're causing more trouble than you are benefits. And so you have those initial hagiographies, okay? And then in the 1960s, at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, you have a huge 180-degree turn in the history books. At that point, right, it becomes conflict history. Instead of giving the benefit of the doubt that Junipero Serra, Francisco Palau, and these other missionaries in California had genuinely, altruistic, humanitarian, religious concerns, it was all depicted as a power competition, that they just wanted power over the Native Americans, and they wanted to exploit them. They wanted to materially enrich themselves and the missions at the expense of the victimized Native Americans. They also were guilty of cultural genocide, of killing the culture of California's Native Americans and forcing them to become, quote, Hispanicized, right? So that was a huge 180 in the 1960s in the history books. Then when people started getting kind of tired of that simple dichotomy of making heroes of the Spanish missionaries or making villains of them, you had people who said, like in the 70s, well, we're going to focus on the agency of the Native Americans. We don't want to just depict them as passive victims. We want to show what they did, what they did that mattered, right? So, for instance, you have evidence of Native Americans playing one Spanish power against another for their own benefit. For instance, hacendados, the leaders of the haciendas adjacent to the missions, would often offer employment opportunities and payment opportunities to the mission natives. Sometimes the missionary natives, the neophytes, would claim that they were going to run away if they did not get the same type of payment from the missionaries as they were offered from the hacendados. And so sometimes they would pit one possible employer against another to get the best possible terms for themselves. In some cases, they began to straddle both worlds. They made ultimatums to the missionaries that certain times of the year they were going to leave, and they would go back to practicing some of their Native American culture, customs, including religious ones that were seen to be pagan and non-Christian, and then come back and then practice the daily catechism and everything of the Catholic Church in the missions. So some of them, they deliberately straddled both worlds, and they didn't even try to hide it. And they, there's a sense of pride in that they had some autonomy in deciding their own destiny. So those are examples of Native American agency, of doing what they wanted to do and having some power and making decisions that mattered themselves. Then by the 1990s, you had people that were tired of all those different forms of showing the power of the downtrodden, or victimizing with the downtrodden, or glorifying the paternalistic Spaniards at the missions. And they said, let's just look at it in terms of inadvertent consequences. And of course, inadvertent means accidental, right? So they look at how when the Spaniards came, they brought pigs, they brought cattle, and all these things that destroyed some of the Native Americans' ecosystems, completely destroyed certain genuses of plants and animals. The Spaniards inadvertently brought disease into the missions, and that killed a lot of neophytes. And so then you have, like I said, inadvertent consequences of things that just happened to happen, despite whether it was meant. And usually it's insinuated that it was not meant, but it happened nevertheless, not intended. And then also you have functional history. Those who said, you know what, we're going to just look at the role that the neophytes played, the role that the Spanish friars played, and how American economy and culture came to be what it came to be. No right or wrong, no good guys or bad guys, but just that's what functional history is just looking at society as like one human body, and everyone plays a role, right? Maybe the Native Americans are metaphorically the legs that are doing the grunt work economically, and the Spanish friars are the head with the brains and leading, making the major decisions of the economy, etc. And you just see what each demographic did to make the whole body function and go to the direction in which it went. So what I did is I straddled the fence on number 4. I did all the above and just said the Spanish missions were a mixed bag. There seems to have been some genuine self-sacrifice and well-meaning, well-intentioned benevolence on behalf of some leaders, like perhaps Junipero Serra. There's evidence of corporal punishment, economic exploitation, and victimization of the natives, for sure, like the civil rights era historiography. There's evidence of agency of Native Americans doing their thing and making their demands be known and recognized and carried out. And there's evidence of inadvertent changes that happened, whether the Spaniards meant to or not, to the California, ecosystems, economy, culture, people, landscape. And then there's evidence of functionalism, of just each demographic doing its part to shape California in the way that it was shaped, right or wrong, good or bad. So I just put in there a little bit of all the above and just did the generic thesis that it was a mixed bag. Okay. Then with number 5, what I do is simple deflection. As I say, was English America any better than Spanish America? Because remember, the whole Black legend, right, image implies that the Spanish were uniquely, anonymously, out of the ordinary bad. And so I'm simply deflecting and pointing a finger toward the English and saying, look how oligarchic, look how inequitable their society was. They had their own aristocracy who monopolized key political positions, who monopolized the best lands in the Tidewater region of Virginia, who dictated culture. And then I go even a little bit further. As I said, at least we can give credit where credit's due to the Spanish on a couple counts that you cannot give to the English. So almost going so far on this number as saying that perhaps the Spanish were a lesser evil than the English were, at least in the American South, in places like Virginia. For one, they had a system of accountability, and it was known as the juez de residencia, with the visitor general. They would put sooner or later, all Spanish political leaders under house arrest and give an opportunity for everyone in their area and jurisdiction to come forth with any complaints against their misrule. Then a judge would decide their guilt or innocence. And if they were guilty, they were removed from office and even put in chains and sent back to Spain. The visitador, or the visitor general, came and did this. Juez, right? Like juez is like judgment or judge of residents. They put under house arrest and tried for abuse of power. The English had nothing of that sort. Then secondly, is according to a book that I read not too long ago, is in Spanish America, economic forces were allowed to do their thing. If you were a slave and you lived in or near a city, chances are you would be eventually rented out to do some type of skilled work by your master, because he could just earn a lot of money doing that. It was just a great, enticement that many of them accepted. And by custom, they would allow a small portion of the wages to go to the slave himself. Not all the money went to the master when he was rented out. So eventually that slave could earn enough money that was equivalent to his or her worth on the market. And so hence they could eventually buy their freedom, which is known as manumission. In English America, the English went to great lengths to make it much more difficult for a slave to gain freedom. You had to have the approval of your master. You had the approval of the governing legislator and governor as well. They made it deliberately more difficult to gain your freedom. Then once you were given freedom in many of the southern colonies, you had to leave the colony because they would not tolerate free blacks in their state, in their colony, because they thought that it would entice the slaves to want to fight for their freedom, seeing some of their brethren living in freedom. But that didn't seem to happen in Spanish America. You had a much higher rate of manumission and the slaves getting to stay and live in freedom in the cities where they were. And in fact, they had a law in 1513 of mestizaje, which is miscegenation. And miscegenation is interethnic marriage and sex. So black people could intermarry and have children with white people in Spanish America. That was not allowed in English America. So with those two examples, right, you might make the argument that it was a lesser evil. That in some places of English America, it was even worse than Spanish America. So that's what I'm doing on number 5. All right. And then the last one, 2 ironies of Spanish colonization. Okay. Pretty straightforward, I believe. Okay. One is the Spanish are going to contend in one of their arguments of justification in taking and conquering the Americas that they were bringing civilization to the Native Americans. Well, when you look at those facets to their civilized status, almost without exception, you guys, they didn't invent them in Spain themselves. They piggybacked from other people who either immigrated to Spain or who conquered Spain and brought those things to them. So I find that ironic, right? That they justify being a civilized power against the Aztec and these other Native American tribes, but all that which they claim made them civilized, they didn't come up with themselves. To me, that's the first irony. All right. So, for instance, you had the Celtic people who may have brought not only metallurgy, but even the farming revolution in the Bronze Age to the native Spaniards who were known as Iberians. That was the Greek name for them. So the Celtic people helped them out right off the bat. Then the Greeks came and they brought in coinage, money-based economy and trade, the emporias, right, where they get the term emporium. On the Mediterranean coast of Spain, the Greeks came and colonized there and brought a lot of things to do with economics to the Spanish people. All right. The Phoenicians gave them their alphabet, mining, stelae, sophisticated weapons, and the Phoenicians were from Lebanon, as you see there in red. They were Near Eastern, ironworking. And then the Romans from 250 BC. Regarding law, language, and religion, the Spanish colonizers would incessantly contend that their civilizing contribution to the Americas brought much advancement to the hemisphere. All three, according to historians like William D. Phillips Jr. and Carla Ron Phillips, have been heavily influenced by, if not borrowed from, Rome. Roman law under the 12 Tables, also known as the Lex Hortensia, was established in Roman-conquered Spain, or Hispania, and the subsequent Spanish Liber Judiciorum constitution would be modeled after its Roman predecessor. Christianity was eventually imported into Spain from the Roman Empire via leaders like Theodosius, as were classic architecture, urban layout of cities, right? Aqueducts, amphitheaters, public baths, temples, stadiums, schools, all that brought by the Spaniards. Then the Moors, right? The Umayyad Caliphate. They had a renaissance in Cordoba, Spain. People from all over the world came to see the court of, for instance, Ibn al-Ramad III. He had the best cartographers making maps. He had the best in mathematics, the best in poetry, philosophy, etc. So all the arts and sciences were just greatly enhanced by the North African Moors and Arabs who were brought there from the Near East, because the Moors constituted the majority of the soldiers who came and conquered, right, from North Africa. They had been like Berbers and other North African, not sub-Saharan, but yet African people. But then they were put under the jurisdiction of the Umayyads in the Near East, and they brought in a lot of Arabic leaders as well. So again, if you wanted to add a third contradiction or irony, I would say, what is with these legal requirements of having cleanness of blood to be in a high position of power in Spanish America? So much for cleanness of blood. We talked about Celtic, Greek, Roman, North African, Near Eastern, and all these other demographics and blood that have flown through Spain. As for technological innovation, while the ancient Iberians may have invented farming, the Visigoths, that's another group that I didn't mention much of. The Western Goths or Visigoths took over when Rome fell, between Rome and the and the North African invasion. Brought Roman methods of increased agricultural output, metallurgical innovation came from immigrant Celtic people, etc. All right, the Moors introduced them to gunpowder, the crossbow, and other weapons that would later facilitate the Spaniards' conquest of Native America. Then the other irony is the Spaniards engaged in a lot of the same exploitative practices over the Native Americans that they conquered that had been practiced and used against them centuries prior. So, for instance, when the Romans conquered the Iberians of Spain and named it España, they issued latifundias. They gave plantations and land, as well as the forced labor of the Iberian Spaniards, over to the Roman conquerors. And what do you know? They just changed the name to encomienda, and they did that against the Native Americans. Okay. So I have there, how ironic that the Spaniards would later make serfs of Native Americans working on Spanish plantations via the encomienda system and mines known as the repartimiento, which the Romans did as well. The encomienda was private, right? You as a private soldier, if you vanquished the enemy, you were entitled to lands and the entitlement to the labor of those that you conquered. The repartimiento was public. It was Spain, the Spanish government itself would require the certain number of Native Americans each year to fight as soldiers or to engage in public works or to go and work in the mines for the Spanish, for those who were connected and had royal monopolies and licenses to engage in mining of gold. There were few windows of socioeconomic mobility for the Iberians when they were conquered by the Romans, by the North Africans. But oftentimes, what were the only avenues? They were through the church or the military. To be seen as a very pious clergyman, you could be a poor colonized person, or to be a good fighting soldier. You could move up as a colonized person. And what do you know? Those are the two main avenues that the Native Americans had alone to have a chance of rising in Spanish America. So I find that to be secondly ironic that the Spaniards would later engage in the same imperialistic practices, exploitative practices that had been once used against them in their history. All right, so does anyone have any questions on number 6, numbers 1 through 5? All right, could I get a couple thumbs up that you guys feel relatively better after this long lecture, that you feel relatively better about doing this assignment? And if not, please tell me why. Tell me specifically what. Just go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or anything that you'd like me to rehash.
I do have a question. It's a little bit off topic, but I do have a question mainly about like the test and stuff.
Sure.
So I was seeing that you're using slides. Is that going to be available to us or is it not?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll tell you what, I'll do you one better, okay, Joey? I can make a study guide for the test as well. So
Okay.
I'll put this PowerPoint up, I'll post it, and I'll also post a study guide for test 1.
And then another one about the test. Is there like a time frame or anything about it? Like or is it just whenever we get done, we get done?
You know what? First of all, I never, I have the option to choose a time limit. I do not ever choose that. I want you to take
Okay.
as much time as you need, but I have heard from students that Canvas itself has it so that if you go away for a while and come back, it sometimes doesn't work.
Okay.
Yeah, so be careful. But yeah, I mean, if you just sit at one sitting and you take even up to like 2 hours to take the test, it should be fine.
All right. And then for the last one, because I'm noticing there is a lot of information with this one. Uh, if this is going to be similar to the first assignment, how can we differentiate or choose between what's more important when it comes to writing like the analysis and stuff?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, Remember, everything centers around every bit of information you type and submit to me, okay? Is to revolve around what you see to be the thesis. All right.
Okay.
So whatever number you did, get right to the point right away. I love it when they do it in the very first thesis, the very first sentence. Tell me immediately what the thesis is to that number, and then just tell me what you think are maybe at least two examples of the most prevalent, what stood out to you the most as being the most perhaps compelling pieces of evidence that support that thesis.
All right.
Okay. And then
All
on the
right. Thank you so much.
evaluation, it's all up to you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking. I love when students ask questions. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions or anything you'd like me to make clear?
Hi, Professor. I do. I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
I don't know if I missed it just because I had to take a phone call really quick. But I wanted to know, I know that for the assignment, I know that like the Zoom call that we ended up doing on Monday, I know you mentioned that would be listed in the module, but I didn't see that. I'm just wondering for future assignments, if that link will be there or will be in a different section.
And I'm sorry again, Ms. Garza, what link?
Well, remember how the Zoom calls, these Zoom meetings, they're being, I think you said they're being recorded and then we can watch them after?
Oh, yes.
Yes, I did not see that listed because I think like when I looked at your announcements, it says, check module for those recordings, but they're not in there. So I'm just wondering, like I was there on Monday, but I was trying to rewatch it. And I did go online under, YouTube. So I did look at your other, videos, but I just did not see it there. So I just want to make sure for future if I'm missing something.
No, you're not. It's my shortcoming. I haven't posted it.
Okay.
I
Just wanted to make sure.
apologize.
Okay,
Yeah,
no
so-
problem. Thank you.
No, I apologize, and I will try to be better at that. To post them as quickly as possible as soon as they download after this.
Okay. In the second part of my question too, I wanted to confirm, so I already uploaded like my assignment. When you review them and give the feedback, are you going to also kind of give us just to make sure that we're, writing it in accordance to what you're looking for? Because I did break it down like on your sample, but I just wanted to, moving forward, to kind of know, did I do it right,
Absolutely.
Okay.
And to be brutally honest with you, there are over 80 students and you're turning these in like every other day.
Yeah.
And so I will not continually do that because I just don't have enough time. But it is only fair for you that I always feel like I have to do it the first two assignments.
Yes.
At the
Okay.
very least, the first two assignments, I will specifically tell you what I like and what perhaps I subjectively was also looking for and may not have been in there. I will do that on at the very least on the first two assignments.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Thank you, guys. I love this. Any other
Professor?
questions?
Professor, I have a question. So is there like any late work policy, like for turning stuff in work late?
Yeah, you know what? I need to make it more concrete because it feels like it's coming across as arbitrary. But whenever if it's a few minutes late, I don't bother it if it's a few minutes after midnight. But if it's a day to 3 or 4, 5 days, I usually take about 5 points off. If it's about a week late, I take 10 points off. And then if you're making it up something from right now at the beginning of the semester, at the very end of the semester, I usually take 20 points off and let you get 30 at the most. It's just, I'm trying to use my discretion on what's fair in balancing being gracious to you guys and giving you an incentive to by all means, something is better than nothing, to always make up any lost work, but being fair to those who are doing it on time. So I try to just find that balance.
And are we allowed to redo work if we get like any bad score on anything?
You know what? I haven't done that, to be honest. But I tell you what, I tell you what I can do is from several semesters back, I have an extra credit option. I'll write that for myself right now. I could post that. So if any of you are interested in doing an extra credit assignment, that'll be available for you. How about that? Okay.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay, great. That's great with me too. All right, any other questions? I know it's a lot of information on this one. The Black Legend is just, it covers several centuries, a large geographical area. But I think the study guide, when I post a study guide, that'll be helpful for you. So you won't feel overwhelmed. Just see, okay, I see just numbers such and such to such and such pertain to the Black Legend. And I'll specifically put on each number what will be asked.
I do have one more question.
Yes.
The last assignment, I was a bit confused on how to do it. So if, for instance, I did something similar to what your example was, would that dock me points, or would it still count even if I changed it to a version of like my own words, adding my own stuff onto it?
Well, that's tough to say, but without seeing it, Joey, like I said, first of all, I grade more leniently on the very first question, knowing this is brand new to you guys. My style is brand new to you guys. So remember that I grade point wise more leniently right off the bat. And also I will respond, I will specifically tell you what I was subjectively looking for that was and was not found in what you have written. And I'm counting on that being of great help for you.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Anybody else? Okay, so I will spread this information on by way of an announcement. The extra credit, the study guide. And then I have on top of all my notes, I have post with an exclamation point. So I know to tell myself to try to regularly and as quickly as possible post these videos. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the day, okay? Again, we will meet on Friday. I appreciate your attendance. Like I said, this will merit 5 extra credit points for you each time. So this is to the Black Legend, and Friday will pertain to Southern colonies as they will be due because we have the Juneteenth off. It's anomalous. It's different. You have actually until the 20th, the night of the 20th, to turn it in. Okay, so thank you guys. If it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, okay? All right, you guys take care.